Hello everybody, here we are again with Mr Penguin and the Fortress of Secrets, and as promised we're going to read chapter 2 and maybe some more today. So just to recap where we left off, the last paragraph, little did they know that Colin was a kung fu master and he was more than ready for them. Chapter 2. Fetch the briefcase, Mr Penguin. In the next few moments, a lot of things happened. The bodyguard stamped his foot, but Colin was too quick. He sprang up into the air and biffed the gigantic bodyguards on their noses before they knew what was happening. Pow, pow! He clonked their heads together, they staggered backwards, and the one holding the briefcase dropped it. The glamorous lady screeched like an angry owl and dived to catch hold of the briefcase. But as she did, Colin swung his web lasso, flung it round her ankle and yanked her away. She fell down with a thud. All around her the crowd started to panic and squeal as she tried to furiously claw back across the floor to her precious briefcase. From the back of the orchestra, the elderly lady with the pigeon on her head stood up and yelled, "Fetch the briefcase, Mr Penguin!" Mr Penguin, who'd been gawping at the action with his beak flapping open, leapt to attention. "Oh yes," he cried. "Righty-o, Edith!" He hopped down from his conductor's pedestal and began waddling across the dance floor as fast as he could, apologising very politely to everyone he bumped into. The band, sensing that something thrilling was about to happen, broke into a raucous, dramatic and exceedingly poppy piece of music that matched the action perfectly. The dancers and waiters tottered this way and that in a giddy panic. Tables fell over, champagne glasses shattered on the floor, and chairs were knocked flying as everyone tried to skitter out of the way of whatever was happening. Mr Penguin ripped off his wig and dinner jacket as he weaved through the confusion of legs, revealing a little orange satchel flung across his chest. And there's a little picture of what is happening. He grabbed his dashing adventurer's hat from the bag and plonked it sternly on his head. Then he skidded to a halt, stretched out a flipper and grabbed the briefcase. At exactly the same moment, the glamorous lady broke free from Colin's web lasso and also snatched the briefcase. Time seemed to stand still. Everyone stopped and stared. The delicate gold watch on the lady's wrist tick-tocked loudly. Mr Penguin and the lady glared at each other as they both held the briefcase. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. "Get on with it, Mr Penguin!" yelled Edith from somewhere in the crowd. Mr Penguin slapped the lady's hand with his free flipper. She gasped, and Mr Penguin didn't hesitate. He wrenched the case away. "Come on, Colin," he cried, tucking the briefcase under his flipper and leaping to his feet. "Let's scarper." The two friends waddled and weaved their way across the dance floor towards the back exit. Edith and Gordon the pigeon were already there waiting. "Excellent work, Mr Penguin," Edith called, grinning as she and Gordon scampered down the stairs. Colin and Mr Penguin were just about to follow her when thud! Mr Penguin skidded and flew face first into the large belly of one of the bodyguards, which was now blocking the door. With a boing, Mr Penguin shot back across the room. "Quick, Colin!" he cried in midair. "To the other exit!" He landed heavily on his bottom, leapt up again and ran as fast as he could. The two chums swerved towards the other set of doors, but once again they were foiled. The other bodyguard stood in the doorway, snarling and rubbing his fists together. "Colin," said Mr Penguin, "we're trapped. There's no escape." He could feel himself getting quite panicky and a bit hot under his bow tie as the glamorous lady pushed through the crowds towards them. Luckily, Colin was, as usual, calm as a cucumber. He nudged Mr Penguin's bottom across the dance floor towards the edge of the roof. "Colin," said Mr Penguin nervously, "there isn't an exit over there. The stairs are out away. He glanced over his shoulder. The lady and the 2 bodyguards were racing towards them, but Colin had doubled his pace. Soon he and Mr. Penguin were standing right on the edge of the building. 9 stories below them, cars and rickshaws bustled along the busy streets. A night market was in full swing, sizzling with rich and exotic smells. As Mr. Penguin looked down, his head swam and his knobbly knees knocked. "I hope you're not thinking about jumping off this building," he hissed out of the side of his beak, glancing sideways at Colin. His friend was holding up his notepad. I wonder what it says. It said, "Hold on." And then on the next page, "Tight." Mr. Penguin barely had time to read the words before Colin gave him a shove, and the 2 friends hurtled off the edge of the hotel down to the busy street below. I wonder what's going to happen. Chapter 3. A roaring engine. And there they are, falling from the top of those 9 stories down towards the busy street below. The night air whistled past Mr. Penguin's ears as he fell from the rooftop. In his panic, it was all he could do to hold on to the briefcase with one flipper and clamp his other flipper to his hat. Bump! Mr. Penguin and Colin hit an intricately carved windowsill and bounced like 2 rubber balls boinging off the walls of a squash court. "Oh no, oh no, oh no!" cried Mr. Penguin. He gritted his beak, waiting to crash on the ground. But suddenly he hit something and pinged right back up into the air. He opened an eyelid a crack and saw that he'd bounced off one of the bendy flagpoles at the hotel's main entrance. Mr. Penguin was now flying upwards towards the roof, in the direction of the mean-faced bodyguards and their villainous boss. He didn't know what was worse, hurtling towards the ground or flying up to meet those brutes with their hand-sized fists. Luckily, neither of those things happened. In a flash, Colin lassoed his friend with another glistening strand of web and tugged him back downwards. The pair were once again zooming towards the market below. Mr. Penguin yelped and closed his eyes. Rip! They tore through one of the hotel canopy shades and, crash, squelch, landed in a large crate of, I wonder if you can guess what they might have landed in. They landed in a large crate of satsumas on the back of a rickshaw. Breathlessly, Mr. Penguin sat up. Both he and Colin were covered in sticky orange pulp. There's a little picture there. The briefcase fell open. The lock must have been broken in the crash, and Mr. Penguin grabbed the object from inside, shoving it into his satchel. The 2 adventurers jumped out of the crate and shook themselves dry-ish. "Where now?" Mr. Penguin asked, frantically looking about. All around him was a fuzzy blur of activity. Traffic whizzed by and market stall holders were shouting about the grub sizzling on their huge pans. Mr. Penguin's tummy rumbled. "Oh," he thought happily, "I could just do with a bite to—" Colin tapped him on the flipper. His pad said, "Over there." And Colin pointed across the street. To Mr. Penguin's surprise, Edith was sitting on the back of an enormous and actually not terribly safe-looking motorbike. Gordon, serene, that means calm, as always, was nestled neatly on top of her headscarf. And you can see the picture there. Colin grabbed Mr. Penguin by the flipper before he could ask any questions, and they weaved their way across the busy streets. "Yikes!" Mr. Penguin cried as a car whizzed past his beak. "Crikey!" he yelped as a bike teetering with a tower of parcels narrowly avoided his foot. "Great prawn crackers!" Mr. Penguin squawked as Colin pushed him out of the way of a racing rickshaw. Eventually, they made it to the other side of the road. "Where did you get that motorbike from, Edith?" Mr. Penguin shouted over all the noise. Edith looked a bit sheepish. What do you think the word sheepish means? Maybe ask your grown-ups what you think that might mean. "I've borrowed it," she said, not quite meeting his eye. "But don't you worry about that now. Just hop on the back, quick, Mr. Penguin, they're behind you." Mr. Penguin looked over his shoulder and squeaked. Sure enough, the two big bruisers from the roof were now in the street, shoving a young man off his motorbike. They hopped onto it and revved the engine, surging through the traffic right towards Mr. Penguin and his gang of adventurers. Edith grabbed Mr. Penguin by the satchel and heaved him onto the motorbike. Colin hopped on behind him, not breaking eye contact with the beefy crooks for a second. Mr. Penguin wrapped his flippers tightly around Edith's bum bag. With a roar of the engine and a squeal from the tyres, they set off into a cloud of dust. Then we do one more chapter. Chapter 4.